Something happened this week that nobody in Washington, Tehran, or Beijing saw coming. China, Iran's most important economic lifeline, the country that has been quietly buying Iranian oil and keeping the regime alive for years, just signaled to the world that it is no longer willing to stand behind Iran the way it used to. And when China moves, the entire strategic picture of the Middle East shifts with it. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile choke point through which 20% of the world's oil passes every single day, will never look the same again after what Beijing just did. Stay with me for the next 20 minutes, because this story has layers that the mainstream media is not connecting for you. And by the time we're done, you will understand exactly why this moment is bigger than almost anything else that has happened in this conflict so far. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to FlashPoint Intel. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you never miss an update. We cover the stories behind the headlines, the strategic moves that the cable networks gloss over, and we do it without the noise. Subscribe, because this one is going to matter. Now let's go back to the beginning of this relationship. Because to understand why China flipping on Iran is such a seismic event, you have to understand how deep that relationship actually goes. For years, the United States and its allies have been trying to strangle Iran economically through sanctions. The theory was simple. Cut off Iran's oil revenue, drain the treasury, make the regime too economically weak to fund its military adventures, its proxy networks, its nuclear ambitions. And on paper, the sanctions should have worked. Iran's oil exports collapsed, foreign investment dried up, the Iranian rial went into freefall. Ordinary Iranians watched their purchasing power evaporate. The economy contracted badly. By every conventional economic metric, Iran should have been on its knees within a few years of maximum pressure being applied. But Iran did not collapse. And the reason Iran did not collapse has one name: China. Beijing stepped in and began buying Iranian oil at heavily discounted prices. Prices that Iran had no choice but to accept, because China was essentially the only major buyer willing to ignore American sanctions. Estimates from various intelligence and energy research organizations suggest that China was absorbing somewhere between 500,000 and over 1 million barrels of Iranian crude per day at the peak of this arrangement. That is an enormous volume. That is the difference between an Iranian regime that can function and an Iranian regime that has to make genuinely painful choices about what it can afford to keep running. China was not doing this out of charity. Beijing was getting deeply discounted oil, building economic leverage over Tehran, and simultaneously thumbing its nose at American sanctions enforcement. It was a calculated move that served Chinese interests perfectly, but it also kept the Iranian government standing when American policy was designed to make it fall, and it went beyond oil. Chinese companies, sometimes operating through intermediary networks to obscure the origin of goods, continued supplying Iran with technology, components, manufactured goods, and dual-use materials that the regime needed to keep its industrial base and military programs functioning. The relationship was not a formal alliance. China never signed a mutual defense treaty with Iran. Beijing was always careful to maintain plausible deniability and avoid the kind of direct military commitment that would put Chinese forces in harm's way. But economically, and in terms of trade relationships, China was the oxygen mask keeping the Iranian regime breathing when American policy was trying to suffocate it. This is the context you need in your head when you look at what just happened. Because what Beijing just signaled is not a small adjustment. It is not a minor recalibration at the margins of the relationship. What China just did represents a fundamental reassessment of whether continuing to prop up Iran is actually serving Chinese interests anymore. Here is what happened. Chinese diplomatic sources, through a combination of official statements and what Beijing watchers describe as deliberate back-channel signals designed to reach Washington and Tehran simultaneously, made clear that China is no longer willing to absorb the economic and diplomatic costs of being Iran's primary economic protector at the current level of intensity. The timing is not accidental. China is looking at a Strait of Hormuz that American naval power is actively contesting. It is looking at the disruption to global shipping that the conflict has produced. And it is calculating that the economic damage to Chinese trade interests from a prolonged Hormuz disruption now exceeds the benefit China gets from cheap Iranian oil and the geopolitical satisfaction of defying American sanctions. Let that sink in for a moment. China has run the numbers, and the numbers no longer add up in Iran's favor. It is a global choke point that China depends on as much as anyone. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. A significant portion of that oil moves through the Persian Gulf and through the Strait of Hormuz. Every day that the strait is contested, every day that shipping through the Gulf is disrupted, every day that tanker insurance rates spike and routing becomes complicated and uncertain, that is a day that Chinese energy security takes a hit. China has been willing to tolerate some of this disruption, as long as their relationship with Iran was delivering sufficient offsetting benefits. But as the conflict has intensified and the disruption has grown and the American military has demonstrated a level of effectiveness in the theater that even Beijing had to respect, the calculus started shifting. And then there is the longer-term calculation that Chinese strategists are always running in the background. China's relationship with the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, is enormously important to Beijing's energy security and to China's broader Belt and Road infrastructure ambitions in the region. These Gulf states are not Iranian allies. They are, to varying degrees, aligned with the American security architecture, or at least dependent on American security guarantees for their own protection. Every time China is seen as propping up Iran, while Iran attacks Gulf shipping, attacks Gulf territory, fires missiles that threaten Gulf infrastructure, China takes a diplomatic hit with exactly the partners it most needs to keep friendly. The Gulf states have been quietly signaling to Beijing for months that the Chinese relationship with Iran is creating friction in the Gulf-China relationship, and Beijing has been listening. The specific trigger that appears to have pushed China over the edge into this visible public signal is the combination of two things happening simultaneously. First, American military effectiveness in the theater has been significantly higher than Chinese analysts predicted. The laser weapon deployments, the success of the destroyer transits through the Strait under coordinated Iranian attack, the precision of the retaliatory strikes on Iranian port infrastructure, all of this has told Beijing that Iran's ability to make the Strait ungovernable is more limited than Iranian rhetoric suggested. China bet on Iranian military capability being a stronger deterrent than it has proven to be. That bet is looking worse every week. Second, the American willingness to impose secondary sanctions targeting entities in third countries that do business with Iran, has been signaled more forcefully in recent weeks. And Beijing has reason to believe that Chinese financial institutions and energy companies could face real exposure if the United States decides to enforce secondary sanctions aggressively against Chinese entities involved in Iranian oil transactions. When you put those two factors together, diminishing strategic value of the Iranian relationship combined with increasing economic risk of maintaining it, the Chinese calculation changes. And when the Chinese calculation changes, everything downstream of that calculation changes with it. Now, what does China flipping on Iran actually look like in practice? This is where we need to be precise, because China is not going to do anything dramatic. Beijing does not operate that way. Now, you're not going to see a Chinese foreign minister hold a press conference and announce that China is cutting off Iran. That is not how Chinese strategic communication works. What you're going to see, what you're already beginning to see, is a series of quiet moves that collectively add up to a fundamental shift in the relationship without any single move being declarative enough to force China into an embarrassing public reversal if circumstances change. Chinese state-connected energy companies have been quietly slowing their Iranian oil purchase commitments, not stopping entirely, not announcing a boycott, just slowing, stretching delivery schedules, becoming less responsive to Iranian outreach about new purchase agreements. In the world of oil trade, when your biggest buyer starts being slow to return calls, the message is clear even without anyone saying it directly. Chinese diplomatic engagement with the Iranian nuclear negotiating framework has shifted in tone. Beijing had been providing diplomatic cover for Iranian positions in international forums, using its Security Council veto power as a backstop against resolutions that Tehran found threatening. The signals from Chinese diplomatic channels now suggest that this automatic cover is becoming conditional rather than guaranteed. Iran can no longer assume that whatever it does, China will be there at the Security Council to block consequences. Chinese commercial banks, which had been providing the financial infrastructure for disguised Iranian oil transactions through complex intermediary arrangements, are reportedly tightening their compliance procedures in ways that make the disguised transaction networks more difficult to operate. This is not a shutdown, but it is friction. And friction in financial systems translates directly into reduced operational capacity for the transaction networks that Iran depends on to monetize its oil exports. And perhaps most telling, Chinese officials have made comments in back-channel diplomatic settings that explicitly reference a preference for a negotiated resolution to the Iranian nuclear issue. Comments that signal Beijing wants a deal reached, not because China suddenly loves American foreign policy, but because a deal would end the Hormuz disruption that is hurting Chinese economic interests and would allow the region to stabilize in a way that serves Chinese Belt and Road ambitions better than a prolonged military confrontation does. This is what a Chinese strategic pivot looks like from the inside, not a dramatic announcement. 1,000 small adjustments that collectively move the needle from active support to calculated distance. Now let us talk about what this means for Iran, because the implications for Tehran are severe and they are immediate. The Iranian regime's ability to absorb external pressure has always rested on one assumption, that China would remain in the relationship as a reliable economic backstop, no matter what Iran did militarily or politically. Iranian hardliners made their calculations, including the decision to keep escalating in the Strait of Hormuz rather than accept the negotiated framework that was available, based on the belief that Chinese economic support was essentially unconditional. It was not a written guarantee. It was an assumption built on years of observed Chinese behavior. And that assumption is now cracking. If Chinese oil purchases slow significantly, Iran's oil revenue declines. When Iran's oil revenue declines, the regime faces extremely difficult choices. The IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is not just a military organization. It is an economic empire. It controls significant portions of the Iranian economy and depends on state funding and its own commercial operations for its institutional power. When the money gets tight, the internal politics of the regime get complicated. Different factions that have been unified by a common external enemy start to have disagreements about how to allocate shrinking resources. The hardline faction that has been driving military escalation in the Strait has been able to dominate internal decision-making, partly because the economic situation, while painful, was not at crisis level. Chinese support kept it from reaching crisis level. Remove that support, and the internal political landscape inside the Iranian regime changes. This matters for the negotiations. The negotiating framework that has been on the table, the framework that Iranian hardliners rejected when they announced that agreement is far removed from reality, suddenly looks different when the economic alternative to signing is not a painful but manageable situation, but a genuine financial crisis. Hardliners who could afford to be maximalist when China was the reliable backstop have to recalculate when that backstop starts looking less reliable. And then there is the strategic messaging from other actors. The UAE's decision to formally document Iranian acts of aggression for legal proceedings, Saudi Arabia's quiet but unmistakable alignment with the American position in the theater, Oman's increasing discomfort with being caught between Iranian pressure and American power, all of these regional signals point in the same direction. Iran is becoming more isolated, not less. The coalition that Iranian doctrine always assumed it could fracture, the alignment of Gulf states, American naval power, and European diplomatic engagement, has not fractured. It has hardened. The Strait of Hormuz picture is changing in ways that go beyond any single military engagement. The directed energy deployments, the proven effectiveness of the Aegis combat system against coordinated multi-vector Iranian attacks, the Apache helicopter destruction of IRGC fast attack boats, the precision of the port infrastructure strikes, all of this has established an empirical record of what happens when Iran's doctrine meets American force posture at maximum engagement intensity. That record is visible to Beijing, it is visible to Moscow, it is visible to every government in the region that is making calculations about what side of this conflict serves its long-term interests. China watched 3 American-guided missile destroyers transit the Strait of Hormuz under coordinated Iranian attack and take 0 hits. China watched Iranian port infrastructure get struck with the kind of precision that speaks to a target list built from months of intelligence preparation. China watched directed energy weapons shoot down drones at the cost of electricity. And China's military analysts updated their assessments of the operational balance in the theater. Those updated assessments fed into the strategic calculation that produced the shift we are now seeing in Chinese behavior toward Iran. The phrase that captures what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is one that military strategists use when a doctrine has been operationally disproven. The doctrine is broken. Iran spent years building the coastal defense architecture, the missile batteries, the drone swarm capability, the fast attack boat network, the command and control infrastructure, the entire system designed to make the Strait too expensive for American power to contest. May 7th proved that the system does not work the way Iranian planners designed it to work against the specific force posture that the United States has deployed. And when a doctrine is broken by operational evidence, the political calculations built on that doctrine have to be rebuilt from scratch. Iran's hardliners built their political position inside the regime on the argument that military resistance was viable, that the doctrine was sound, that continued escalation would eventually force American accommodation. That argument is harder to make after May 7th, and it becomes harder still when the country that was supposed to be the economic backstop for continued resistance starts sending signals that its unlimited support is not actually unlimited. The question everyone is asking, the question that the Iranian regime's decision-making structure is trying to answer right now, is whether the hardline faction will read these signals and adjust its position, or whether it will double down on escalation in the belief that one more push will break American political will. The history of this conflict suggests the hardliners will be tempted to escalate. Their institutional identity is built around resistance. Their political power inside the regime is built around being the faction that refuses to capitulate. Accepting a deal that includes the kind of verification requirements and limitations on the nuclear program that the negotiating framework contains would require the hardliners to accept terms that undermine the case they have been making for their own indispensability. But the environment those hardliners are operating in has changed in ways that even they have to acknowledge. The Chinese signals are not happening in isolation. They are happening while the military situation in the Strait is going against Iran. They are happening while the Gulf states are hardening their alignment with the American position. They are happening while European partners, who had been pressing Washington to hold the ceasefire and give diplomacy room to work, are now looking at Iranian behavior in the Strait and finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the diplomatic cover that European engagement was providing for Tehran. Iran's strategic situation is not where it was 6 months ago. The oxygen supply is getting thinner, and the country that was supposed to be the oxygen provider just quietly turned down the flow. For the Strait of Hormuz itself, the long-term implications of this shift are profound. The Strait's strategic significance has always rested on two things: its geography, which creates a genuine physical choke point, and Iran's doctrine, which was designed to exploit that geography in ways that would make the choke point economically and militarily unmanageable for American naval power. The geography has not changed. The strait is still 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but the doctrine that was supposed to make those 21 miles ungovernable has been operationally challenged at every level simultaneously. The drone swarms ran into directed energy weapons. The fast attack boats encountered Apache helicopters. The missile salvos were handled by Aegis. The port infrastructure that coordinated all of it is damaged. And now the economic architecture that was supposed to sustain Iran's ability to keep fighting indefinitely is showing cracks. A Strait of Hormuz, where Iran's ability to threaten is diminished, where Chinese economic backstopping is reduced, where American military effectiveness has been empirically demonstrated, and where regional alignment is moving against Tehran. That is a fundamentally different strategic environment than the one that existed at the start of this conflict. It is not a resolved environment. Iran still has ballistic missiles. It still has hardened military facilities. It still has proxy networks. It still has the ability to cause serious damage. Do not misread this analysis as suggesting that Iran is finished. The conflict is not over. The danger is not gone. But the strategic trajectory has shifted in a direction that was not guaranteed and was not inevitable. And the China factor is a central part of why it shifted. The other thing that the China move signals, and this is worth taking a moment on, is what it says about the limits of autocratic solidarity as a strategic calculation. There has been a persistent narrative in geopolitical analysis that the authoritarian bloc, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, represents a coherent counter-coalition to American power and American-led international institutions. The narrative has real elements of truth. These governments do coordinate. They do provide each other with varying degrees of support. They do share a common interest in reducing American influence, but the China move on Iran is a reminder that these relationships are transactional at their core. China did not sign up to absorb unlimited economic costs for unlimited Iranian military adventurism. When the costs exceeded the benefits in Beijing's calculation, the relationship adjusted. Autocratic solidarity has limits, and those limits are defined by national interest calculations that no amount of ideological affinity fully overrides. Russia is watching this. North Korea is watching this. Every government that has based strategic calculations on the assumption that Beijing's support is something close to unconditional is now looking at what happened to Iran and updating its understanding of what Chinese partnership actually means. FlashPoint Intel has been tracking this shifting Chinese position for several weeks, and what we are seeing now is the public manifestation of signals that were visible in the background for some time. The pace of change in this theater has been remarkable. The combination of military developments in the Strait and diplomatic and economic realignments happening simultaneously is producing a strategic environment that is genuinely fluid in a way that it was not even 60 days ago. Where this goes next depends primarily on what Iran's decision-making apparatus produces in the near term. If the hardliners maintain control and push for further escalation, the military engagement in the Strait will intensify, and the broader international pressure on Iran, including potentially sharper pressure from China, will also intensify. If the moderating signals within the Iranian system gain enough traction, some form of negotiated off-ramp becomes possible. The framework is still technically on the table. The conditions for Iranian acceptance of that framework are worse today than they were a month ago, which paradoxically might make acceptance more likely rather than less if the regime concludes that the alternative is continued deterioration with no prospect of reversal. The directed energy systems are still charged on those destroyers in the Gulf of Oman. The F-35s are still ready on the ramps at the basing locations in the theater. The target list in the CENTCOM options brief still exists with its full depth of potential targets beyond what the love-tap strikes addressed. And China has just told Iran, in the quiet diplomatic language that Beijing uses when it wants to send a message without declaring a policy, that the relationship has changed. The Strait of Hormuz will never be the same, not because the geography changed. Because everything that gave Iran's doctrine its credibility, the economic backstop, the assumption of Chinese unconditional support, the belief that the drone swarm strategy was economically sustainable against American naval assets, the confidence that a coordinated multi-vector attack would produce hits on American destroyers. All of that has been tested, and all of it has come up short in ways that even Iran's most committed hardliners cannot entirely explain away. That is the story behind the headlines this week. China did not just adjust a trade relationship, it sent a signal that will reverberate through Iranian strategic planning, through Gulf state calculations, through American diplomatic strategy, and through every government on earth that has been watching this conflict and deciding what it means for their own relationship with Beijing. The shift is real. The implications are significant. And the next chapter in this story is being written right now in the bunkers where Iranian hardliners are making their next decision, in the trading rooms where Chinese energy companies are reviewing their Iranian commitments, and in the navigation charts of the 3 American-guided missile destroyers that sailed clean through the most contested naval transit in the modern era, and came out the other side without a single scratch. If this breakdown gave you something that the regular news coverage missed, do me one favor right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think China's next move is. Are they fully walking away from Iran, or is this a temporary adjustment that reverses if the situation changes? I genuinely want to know what you think. And the comment section here at FlashPoint Intel is where those real conversations happen. Share this video with someone who is following this conflict, because understanding the China dimension is the piece that most people are missing right now, and it is the piece that changes everything.